Section 3. The USSR imposes a Stalinist regime on Poland. At the beginning of the war, Stalin tried to cooperate with the Polish government in London. However, the main stumbling block was the Polish borders in the east, that is, the lands which the USSR seized from Poland in 1939. When attempts at dialogue failed, Polish troops loyal to the government in exile were withdrawn from the USSR to the Middle East, where they helped to fight the British against the Germans. The Polish government in exile created the Home Army, Armia Krajowa in Poland itself. This army resisted both the fascists and the unit of the Red Army. Poland in 20th century writes, Armia Krajowa, AK, began to switch to armed resistance to Soviet troops and the Polish government allied with the USSR, and many commanders did not always control the actions of their units. In the fall of 1944, resistance increased. There were attempts by AK units to seize power on the ground, counteract the PCNO, that is the Soviet allied government, terrorize and destroy representatives of its administration, as well as soldiers and officers of the Red Army. Stalin created state apparatus in Poland consisting mostly of Soviet military personnel. The most famous figure was General Konstantin Rokossovsky, who was a Pole by birth but a Soviet officer. After the end of the war, he became the head of the Polish General Staff. Quote, in the Polish General Staff, of the 159 most important positions, 110, that is over 70%, were occupied by Soviet officers, many of whom were ethnic Poles. Section 4. A clash of the USSR and the Anglo-American bloc over Poland. The USA and Great Britain were interested in the USSR bearing the main burden of the war against Germany, and after victory, helping the USA suppress Japan. According to the Yalta Agreements, Poland moved into the sphere of interest of the USSR. Quote, on February 6, 1945, the US president sent Stalin an important political signal. Your army advancing towards Berlin must have a secure rear. You cannot and we must not tolerate any provisional government that will cause your armed forces any trouble of this kind. I want you to know that I am fully aware of this. And further, I hope that I do not need to assure you that the United States will never support in any way any provisional government in Poland which would be hostile to your interests. Churchill made sufficient reservations for Stalin. The British government recognizes that attacks on the Red Army in the rear are unacceptable. And, of course, we cannot ask Stalin for anything that would interfere with military operations of the Soviet troops. These operations must come first. Thus, the British Prime Minister and the US President gave carte blanche to Moscow to forcefully suppress the military political underground. Just as Stalin beheaded the Communist Party of Poland in 1936-38. He also beheaded the Polish government in exile, inviting it in the spring of 1945, allegedly for negotiations near Moscow. Meetings and conversations between representatives of the parties ended on March 27-28, 1945, near Warsaw, in the city of Pruszków, where a number of leading figures of the underground were isolated. Okulicki and Jankowski were arrested in Warsaw. Instead of the promised trip to London, the Poles were taken to Moscow and imprisoned by the NKVD in Lubyanka. The arrest of the leaders actually decapitated the military political underground. End of quote. This incident then had international consequences. The United States and England, quote, demanded information about the fate of 16 missing Polish politicians. In early May, information about the arrest was provided by Moscow. Insisting on clarifying the issue, the United States and Great Britain blocked the work of the Commission of Three. Washington stopped supplies of military and other products to the USSR under Lend-Lease agreement, part of which was paid for in gold and diamonds. A number of signals from Great Britain were unacceptable to Moscow. Churchill was firm when speaking about the Iron Curtain that had fallen along the front line. May 18th, talking with the Soviet ambassador Gusev, Churchill was indignant that we named Polish candidates for negotiations and you put them in prison. Polish affairs are driven into a dead end, and promised not to allow to be treated rudely and to infringe on our interests. Soviet ambassador reported to Moscow, the English press is taking a new anti-Soviet course, and English parliamentary circles, Polish agents are waging an unbridled anti-Soviet campaign. End of quote. Churchill, meanwhile, was creating a plan for the war against the USSR. Quote, the plan for the emergency operation Unthinkable was developed, most likely on the instructions of Churchill in April, and it was dated May 22, 1945. It contained a definition of the goals of the war against the USSR, the direction of attacks of the Allied forces, their results. Judging by the memoirs of the English Prime Minister, it was assumed to immediately create a new front against Russia's rapid advance, which should go as far to the east as possible, to push the Red Army behind the borders of Poland, to inflict such a decisive blow on the Soviet troops, which would exclude the possibility of continuing the war for the leadership of the USSR, to force Russia to submit to the will of the USA and England. It was planned to start the war on July 1, 1945, using the industrial potential of Germany, parts of the Wehrmacht, as well as the Polish armed forces in the West. Due to doubts of the English and American political leadership and high command in achieving their goals, the plan was rejected.